Hello, my name's Chris, what's yours? Welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through the history of James Bond from the very beginning, looking at every novel and film in release order, as well as little pit stops to take a look at other media that came out in between. And you join me at what is maybe, quite possibly, Ian Fleming's most controversial novel. Casino Royale was a relatively small story, a villain embezzling funds from Britain's enemies and desperately trying to win them back by playing cards, with a British secret agent sent to stop him from doing that by essentially basically just being better than him at cards. Now, obviously, far more happened in the novel than that, but it all felt concentrated, contained. So, wisely then, for Bond's second outing, Fleming decided to sort of open things up a bit. The claustrophobia in Casino Royale was a fantastic storytelling tool for generating tension, and as such, Fleming does use it to great effect here when Bond is captured or when the net is closing around him. But in a literal sense, this book feels far more open. More location hopping gives Live and Let Die that bit more scope than its predecessor, and because that feels like a progression in this particular area, this does feel like a sequel that's ringing the changes. Now, obviously, a sequel which simply just repeats what's come before is doomed before it starts, but one which makes the universe it takes place in feel more expanded is off to a decent start. Now, I'll get this out of the way at the very beginning so that there's no confusion. No, I do not think this book is better than Casino Royale. But Fleming's approach in how to follow up Casino Royale is definitely the right one. While it may feel decidedly odd that Bond is sent to investigate stolen pirate treasure, Fleming actually weaves this in quite nicely. That the fact that the treasure is being used to fund Soviet operations in the States roots this contemporaneously, and the fact that it's stolen pirate treasure is just a really fun way of getting Bond involved. As a starting point for a plot, you couldn't really get much more different from a villain playing cards to win back embezzled funds than this. This is not how you would expect a follow-up to that taut, tight thriller Casino Royale to begin. And by doing this, in only the second entry into the Bond canon, Fleming has shown that there is so much you can do with this property. This might seem like an odd comparison, but bear with me, because there are sequels that just feel like the original, repeated verbatim, and then there are others which feel markedly different, and it's these ones that I think demonstrate the necessary variety to go on to create a satisfying body of work. If this had just been Casino Royale 2, there'd have been little point to it, or it could have just killed Bond dead early on. So indulge me when I say that I feel like Live and Let Die is Aliens to Casino Royale's Alien. Alien is a horror movie, Aliens is a flat-out action film, but Ripley is our hero in both. And James Bond is our hero in both Casino Royale and Live and Let Die. And those are two wildly different stories, like Alien and Aliens, with one common hero. And therefore James Bond roots these very different stories in one common canon. And they are such different types of story that Fleming could have easily just created a new hero for this one. The fact that he didn't crafts Bond into an icon which can be dropped into a vast array of different genres, plots and stories. By making Live and Let Die so different from Casino Royale, he ensures Bond's future. Now, all of this would be a moot point if Live and Let Die weren't a good book, so now we get into the question of whether or not it is a good book. It's not a terrible one. Its reputation is sort of flavoured by the controversy around it, and that controversy stems from Ian Fleming's depictions of black Americans. Now, if I say that those depictions of black Americans aren't very good, and more than that, they're insulting, then I'm not just being honest about what I think, I'm kind of also echoing what Ian Fleming himself came to realise. For all the drama the other year about editing Fleming's works, Fleming himself approved certain edits to Live and Let Die reissues when he was given notes on this particular area of his writing. Now, yeah, he may have initially been very proud of how he depicted black Americans. When he was told that he might want to rethink that, he did. Now, when it comes to re-editing Fleming's works, personally, I would prefer it that they didn't and let the historical record stand as it is. But if it opens up the work for more readers, then that can only be a good thing. And if Fleming himself was okay with certain edits to make the works more palatable, then I don't see why we should be so up in arms about it. No, my own opinions on that notwithstanding, Fleming himself responded to criticism and took notes. And even what's left, I do find myself wincing occasionally from decades in the future. But even though I find elements of it, a touch distasteful, enough to affect my enjoyment of the work overall, it isn't a terrible book. Even without all of these elements, which, some of them are offensive for sure, it just lacks that streamlined focus that Casino Royale had. That stripped back nature of Casino Royale made it a bullet of a book. And even though it's sort of missing in Live and Let Die, there are passages, like for example, when Bond goes to Jamaica, that are astonishingly well written. A genuine affection for Jamaica and its people, because obviously, as we know, Fleming loved it enough to spend a lot of his year out there. It all really comes through. And because Fleming's so talented at making breakfast and the rules of a card game sound interesting, when Bond is learning to scuba dive from Quarrel, it's actually quite riveting. It also humanises the man. He has to train, he has to learn. We're so used to seeing James Bond in the films with all of his skill set readily available for him to draw upon. In the books, he's got to learn stuff. He also feels fear. And in the films, we don't get that voice in Bond's head, but Fleming gives us that voice in Bond's head. He finds the villain, Mr. Big, so formidable that when he comes up against him, he has to have a word with himself. This continues that trend of Fleming succeeding at putting an ordinary man in extraordinary situations. The James Bond that most people are familiar with, and right off as a result, would give the bad guy some sass and kill him with a quip. But here, Bond is like, oh, is this it? And that keeps him relatable, and it keeps the reader in the thick of the action. The climax of the keel hauling sequence, which was actually adapted for the film of For Your Eyes Only and not Live and Let Die, is just as well written as the torture scene from the previous book. And obviously another important element of this book is saved over for a film other than Live and Let Die, and that is Felix Leiter's life-changing injuries courtesy of a shark. A driving force of the plot of the film License to Kill actually takes place really early on in the Bond canon. In just the second book, Bond contends with the horrific maiming of his friend. And not only does this hit really hard, it also drives the point home of how much danger Bond puts himself in during these missions. And not only that, because it's done at the orders of the villain, it makes the villain that bit more intimidating. So no wonder Bond is so frightened of him by the end of the book. Now that's not to say that Mr. Big usurps Le Chiffre. Far from it. Now much is made of Mr. Big's colossal intellect, and that's actually a rather positive sketching for a villain. Now sure, he's a big figure in the world of organised crime, but rather than just being a heavy, he's also a genius. And it's really interesting and admirable that Fleming includes that side of his character. Had he just been a hulking brute or a mobster heavy, he simply would not be as strong an antagonist for Bond to go up against. More on that discussion in a couple of books' time. But that he also has brains, and a lot of them, makes him a definite obstacle for Bond to overcome. However, Le Chiffre was such a good villain that Fleming struggles to make Mr. Big an improvement. Same with Solitaire. She's a weaker presence than Vesper and could never hope to have the same impact on Bond. As a result, while his tenderness to her in stretches of this story is written and captured really nicely by Fleming, she can't really escape the feeling that she's a little bit of a hanger-on. Vesper had a crucial part to play in Casino Royale, a woman with her very own stakes in the plot that Bond therefore is able to cross paths with and given the opportunity to fall for. Whereas Solitaire feels like there needed to be a girl, so here she is. I don't know, she just doesn't feel as real as Vesper, almost as if Fleming himself doesn't hold her in as high regard as he did Vesper. And because Vesper was such a good heroine, Fleming struggles to make Solitaire an improvement. As he does with the whole book, to be honest. Live and Let Die is a step down, no question. And even though I've already said I don't think the book is terrible, the main thing that comes to mind when sort of having to appraise it is that it's just not as good as Casino Royale. I don't want to use the difficult second album trope, but Casino Royale definitely felt like the book Ian Fleming set out to write because of a burning desire to. whereas Live and Let Die feels like the product of the pressure to follow it up. As a follow-up, I already said earlier on that it's definitely a good approach. James Bond doesn't feel stale after this. In fact, he feels like he's got plenty more stories in them and they can go off in wildly different directions. So in teeing up the future, Live and Let Die is incredibly successful. But as an entry in its own right, it lacks that alchemical spark that Fleming could sometimes harness when it came to other books. The man could write, of that there is no doubt. So his books will always be, on some level, well put together. But when he captured that part of himself that produced Casino Royale and a few other of the subsequent entries, he was untouchable. And yes, there are elements of this book which, of course, do bring it down for me. If there weren't parts of it, and large parts of it too, that make me cringe as much as I do, then obviously I'd enjoy it far more. But it does exist as a document to which detractors of Bond can point at when they're citing unacceptable qualities of the property. And in this instance, they'd have a point. So an unusual reading experience to say the least. James Bond's second adventure takes in buried pirate treasure and voodoo, widening the scope of his stories considerably. The ambition of Fleming cannot be questioned, even if I do question some of his specific choices when it comes to this novel. The description of Bond's fear when he comes up against Mr. Big at the end of this novel is so unlike anything you would expect of the James Bond character as it is today, that it really does pack a punch. Fleming's depiction and dialogue for Black Americans, it's really not fun reading those. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this look at Live and Let Die, then you know how YouTube works. Please do give it a like and share it around. It would be great to get more Bond fans along for the Supermarathon. And what do you think of Live and Let Die? Is it a superior sequel or one of Fleming's duds? Is the fact that at least 3 separate James Bond films took elements from this a sign of its greatness, or just that it's too thin a story to work as its own film by itself? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon, but not for the next book in the series. Oh no, instead we're going to be looking at the 1954 Climax TV episode Casino Royale, starring Barry Nelson as the very first screen James Bond and Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre. So, if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, bong the bell, and I'll meet you back in Royale Les Hommes.